The sun was setting over Palm Beach, casting long shadows across the pristine streets where million-dollar homes stood like silent sentinels. Officer Robert Wilson sat in his patrol car, his eyes scanning the traffic flowing past him. After 15 years on the force, he thought he'd seen it all, but what happened that evening would change not just his life, but spark a chain of events that nobody could have predicted. The black SUV caught his attention as it cruised down the palm-lined avenue. It was a high-end vehicle, spotlessly maintained, with tinted windows that still fell within legal limits. Something about it made Wilson's instincts tingle, though later he would question whether those instincts were actually something far more problematic. He flipped on his lights, and the SUV pulled over smoothly, the driver obviously familiar with proper procedure. As Wilson approached the vehicle, he noticed the driver was already sitting with his hands visible on the steering wheel. Another sign of someone who knew exactly what to do during a traffic stop. License and registration, Wilson said, his flashlight beam sweeping across the interior. The driver, a middle-aged man dressed in a crisp black suit, reached slowly for his documents. His hands were steady, but there was tension in his voice when he spoke. "Officer, I'm Mr. Trump's personal driver. I've been working for him for 7 years now. Is there a problem with the vehicle?" Wilson's demeanor shifted. Despite the driver's professional appearance and calm explanation, he ordered him out of the car. What should have been a routine stop turned into a 20-minute ordeal. Wilson called for backup, insisting on searching the vehicle despite having no probable cause. He questioned the driver repeatedly about his employment, seeming to doubt the legitimacy of his position despite the proper credentials and company identification. The driver maintained his composure throughout the incident, but his dignity was being stripped away with each passing minute. Other cars slowed as they passed, their occupants watching the scene unfold. Some took out their phones to record, sensing that something wasn't right about the situation. Little did Officer Wilson know that the SUV was equipped with multiple security cameras, standard for any vehicle in the Trump Organization's fleet. These cameras captured every moment of the interaction, every dismissive gesture, every skeptical look, every unnecessary command. The driver had dealt with traffic stops before. It came with the territory when you drove expensive vehicles in exclusive neighborhoods. But this was different. The usual professional courtesy extended to executive drivers was noticeably absent. Instead, Wilson's questioning became increasingly aggressive, his disbelief more apparent with each answer the driver provided. When backup arrived, even the second officer seemed uncomfortable with Wilson's behavior. The new arrival stood back, watching as his colleague continued what was clearly an unnecessary search. The driver's phone rang several times, likely his employer wondering about the delay, but Wilson wouldn't allow him to answer it. Finally, after finding nothing suspicious, as there was nothing to find, Wilson handed back the driver's documents without an explanation for the stop. No ticket was issued, no warning given. Just a curt nod and a dismissive, "You can go." The driver pulled away from the curb with his professional demeanor intact, but his hands were shaking slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. He was late now, very late, and he had to figure out how to explain this situation to one of the most powerful men in America. He didn't know it yet, but the security footage from his vehicle would soon become the catalyst for a story that would ripple through Palm Beach society and beyond. The next 24 hours would set in motion a series of events that would leave the community stunned, force uncomfortable conversations about law enforcement practices, and create the most unlikely of alliances. As the SUV disappeared into the gathering darkness, Officer Wilson returned to his patrol car, making a few routine notes about the stop. He had no idea that this seemingly ordinary evening would be his last as a Palm Beach police officer, or that his actions would soon be at the center of a national conversation about power, privilege, and prejudice in American law enforcement. The morning sun had barely risen over Mar-a-Lago when Trump's driver walked into the grand lobby, his usual confident stride replaced by something more hesitant. He'd spent a sleepless night replaying the traffic stop in his mind, wondering if he should even mention it. But working for Trump meant being honest about everything, especially security issues. The former president was already awake, reviewing documents in his private office when his driver knocked on the door. Trump looked up, immediately noticing something was off about his usually punctual employee. "You're not one to be late," he said, putting down his papers. "What happened last night?" The driver took a deep breath and began explaining the previous evening's events. As he spoke, Trump's expression shifted from curiosity to concern, and then to something rarely seen, quiet anger. He didn't interrupt, didn't tweet, didn't make any immediate proclamations. Instead, he listened, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. "The camera's in the car," Trump said finally. "They recorded everything." "Yes, sir, every minute." "Get me that footage, now." Within an hour, Trump's office became a hub of activity. His security team downloaded and reviewed the videos, while his assistant made calls to Palm Beach officials. The footage was damning, showing not just unprofessional conduct, but a clear abuse of power. The cameras caught every dismissive gesture, every unnecessary command, and most importantly, the complete lack of any legitimate reason for the stop. Trump's response surprised everyone. Instead of his usual public outbursts or social media storms, he worked the phones quietly. He called the Palm Beach police chief directly, then the mayor. His message was clear. This wasn't about politics. This wasn't about publicity. This was about right and wrong. The police chief, initially defensive, changed his tune after watching the security footage. The video showed Officer Wilson violating multiple department protocols, from the baseless vehicle search to his refusal to let the driver answer his phone. But what struck the chief most was the subtle intimidation tactics, the kind that wouldn't show up in a written report but were crystal clear on video. Word spread quickly through Palm Beach's elite circles. Other wealthy residents began sharing similar stories about Officer Wilson, incidents they'd dismissed or hadn't taken seriously before. A prominent banker called Trump's office to report how his housekeeping staff had complained about being repeatedly pulled over. A retired judge mentioned witnessing similar stops, but feeling powerless to intervene. Meanwhile, the driver was surprised by Trump's reaction. Instead of being angry about the delay, Trump was furious about the treatment his employee had endured. He insisted the driver take the next day off, arrange for a counselor if he wanted to talk about the incident, and assured him his job was secure. "You did everything right," Trump told him. "Everything. Now let me handle this." By afternoon, local news stations were getting tips about the story. Reporters began calling Trump's office, but for once, he didn't take their calls. He was focused on something bigger than headlines. He arranged a meeting with community leaders who had been documenting similar incidents for years. His message to them was simple: let's fix this, not for publicity, for real. The Palm Beach Police Department found itself under intense scrutiny. The chief ordered an immediate review of Officer Wilson's record, and what they found was troubling. There was a pattern of similar stops, but most had gone unreported or been dismissed. The victims, often service workers or employees of wealthy residents, hadn't felt empowered to complain. As evening approached, Trump finally agreed to one interview, not with a major network, but with a local reporter who had been covering police accountability issues for years. His statement was uncharacteristically measured. "This isn't about me. It's not about politics. It's about doing what's right. When someone who works for me, who I trust, who does their job perfectly, gets treated this way, that's not just wrong. That's not who we are supposed to be." The day ended with Officer Wilson being placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. But for once, this wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. The next few days would reveal just how deep the problems went and create the most unlikely coalition Palm Beach had ever seen. Nobody knew it yet, but this incident would change not just one police department, but spark a conversation that would ripple through police departments across the country. The Internal Affairs Office of the Palm Beach Police Department hadn't seen this much activity in years. Files were spread across desks, computer screens displayed traffic stop data, and investigators worked late into the night. What had started as a single incident involving Officer Wilson had opened a door nobody could close. "Look at this," said one investigator, pointing to his screen. He'd been reviewing Wilson's dash cam footage from the past 6 months. Same pattern, different drivers. Always during the evening shift, always in the wealthy neighborhoods, always targeting service workers. The investigation team had pulled every traffic stop record, every civilian complaint, and every performance review from Wilson's 15-year career. The picture emerging wasn't pretty. The numbers told the story that couldn't be ignored. Service workers and household staff were being stopped at rates far higher than other drivers in the same areas. But it wasn't just the numbers. As the team dug deeper, they found something even more troubling: buried complaints. Several formal grievances had been filed over the years, but they'd been dismissed or lost in the system. One investigator found a complaint from a gardener who'd been stopped 3 times in 1 month, each time by Wilson, each time without cause. The complaint had mysteriously vanished from official records, only to be found in a misplaced file. The department's computer expert discovered that Wilson had been running unnecessary background checks on drivers, hundreds of them. Most were people who worked in Palm Beach's exclusive communities: housekeepers, maintenance workers, delivery personnel. None of these checks had been part of any official investigation. "We need to talk to these people," the lead investigator said. "Not just review the paperwork. We need to hear their stories." The interviews started slowly. Many were afraid to speak up, fearing they might lose their jobs or face retaliation. But Trump's driver had broken the dam of silence. His story gave others the courage to come forward. A housekeeper described being late to work multiple times because of Wilson's routine stops. A pool maintenance worker talked about losing clients because Wilson's frequent stops made him miss appointments. A delivery driver explained how he'd started taking longer routes just to avoid Wilson's patrol areas. The investigation team set up a hotline for people to report similar experiences. They expected a few calls. They got hundreds. The phone rang constantly with people sharing stories they'd never dared tell before. One call came from a retired police officer who'd worked with Wilson years ago. "I saw what he was doing," the retired officer admitted. "We all did, but nobody wanted to be the one to speak up. You know how it is, you don't turn on your own. I'm not proud of staying quiet, but I'm speaking up now." The team brought in experts to analyze the traffic stop data. The patterns were undeniable. Wilson's stops showed clear targeting based on appearance and vehicle type. Luxury cars with well-dressed drivers were waved through. Service vehicles and workers were stopped, searched, and harassed. But the investigation revealed something bigger than one officer's misconduct. It exposed flaws in the department's oversight system. Complaints weren't being properly logged. Supervisors weren't reviewing body camera footage regularly. Early warning signs had been ignored. The police chief, now under pressure himself, authorized an expansion of the investigation. "We're not just looking at one officer anymore," he announced to his command staff. "We're looking at our whole system. How did we miss this? How do we make sure it never happens again?" Community leaders began holding meetings with the investigation team. They'd brought documentation, years of informal records kept by workers who'd faced similar treatment. Church groups shared stories from their congregations. Local businesses provided security camera footage showing questionable stops in their parking lots. The investigation was making waves beyond Palm Beach. Other police departments started reviewing their own traffic stop data. Civil rights organizations offered support and expertise. What had started with one driver's experience was becoming a case study in how to identify and address systemic problems in law enforcement. As the third week of the investigation drew to a close, the team prepared their preliminary report. It would detail not just Wilson's actions, but the departmental failures that allowed them to continue for so long. The findings would lead to changes nobody had imagined when this all began. The lead investigator stayed late one night, reviewing everything one last time. On his desk was a photo from a community meeting. Trump's driver standing with other workers who'd come forward, all of them finally being heard. Change was coming to Palm Beach, and it had started with one traffic stop that picked the wrong driver on the wrong night. The morning sun glinted off Mar-a-Lago's windows as Trump sat at his desk, reviewing the investigation's preliminary findings. His reading glasses perched on his nose, he flipped through page after page of documented incidents. Each report made his jaw tighten a little more. "Get me the police commissioner," he said to his assistant. "And the mayor. We're having breakfast." His tone wasn't angry, it was determined. This wasn't the bombastic Trump that people were used to seeing on TV. This was Trump the businessman, the negotiator, the deal-maker. The breakfast meeting was set for 8 a.m. at Mar-a-Lago's private dining room. The police commissioner arrived first, then the mayor, both looking uncomfortable in the lavish setting. Trump had the investigation files spread out on a side table, untouched during the initial pleasant conversation over eggs and coffee. "Gentlemen," Trump finally said, pushing his plate aside, We need to talk about what's happening in our community. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The power of his position as a former president and prominent Palm Beach resident carried enough weight. He walked them through the evidence, not just from his driver's incident, but from dozens of others. The security footage, the statistical analysis, the pattern of buried complaints. This isn't about one officer anymore, he said. This is about fixing a broken system. The commissioner tried to defend his department's record, but Trump cut him off, not with anger, but with facts. Look at these numbers, he said, pointing to a graph showing traffic stop patterns. This isn't opinion. This isn't politics. These are facts, and they tell a story we can't ignore. Word of the meeting spread quickly through Palm Beach's elite circles. Other wealthy residents, who'd previously stayed quiet about similar incidents involving their staff, began speaking up. Country club discussions shifted from golf scores to police reform. Social events buzzed with talk about responsibility and community change. Trump's approach surprised many. Instead of his usual social media storms, he worked behind the scenes. He made calls to business leaders, asking them to review their security footage for similar incidents. He reached out to other prominent residents, building a coalition of support for reform. His driver's story became a rallying point. Trump arranged for him to speak at community meetings, sharing his experience with other residents who'd never considered how their workers were being treated. The driver's professional demeanor and clear account of events made the reality of the situation impossible to ignore. Local media caught wind of Trump's involvement, but found him uncharacteristically reserved in his comments. "This isn't about me," he told reporters. "This is about making sure everyone in our community is treated with respect. When people come to work in Palm Beach, they deserve to feel safe, not harassed." The pressure began mounting on the police department. Trump's influence brought national attention, but his approach kept the focus on solutions rather than scandal. He organized meetings between police officials and community leaders, creating dialogue where there had only been silence before. In one particularly powerful meeting, Trump brought together his household staff, groundskeepers, and other service workers to share their experiences with law enforcement. The police commissioner sat quietly, listening to story after story of unnecessary stops, baseless searches, and daily intimidation. "These are the people who make Palm Beach work," Trump said to the commissioner. "They take care of our homes, our gardens, our families. They deserve better than this. And I'm not asking anymore. I'm telling you things need to change." The investigation expanded beyond just traffic stops. Department policies were scrutinized. Training programs were reviewed. Complaint procedures were examined. Trump brought in experts from other cities that had successfully implemented police reforms, creating a blueprint for change. His involvement had an unexpected effect on the community. People who'd never agreed with Trump politically found themselves working alongside him for a common cause. His genuine concern for his employees and his commitment to real change bridged political divides that had seemed insurmountable. As the fourth week of the investigation drew to a close, Trump called another meeting at Mar-a-Lago. This time, he invited community leaders, police officials, and reform advocates. The message was clear. Changes were coming to Palm Beach law enforcement, and they were coming soon. The sun was setting over the Atlantic as the meeting ended. Trump stood on his balcony watching the ocean. His driver approached, thanking him for everything he'd done. Trump shook his head. "Don't thank me," he said. "This should have been done long ago. But we're doing it now, and we're doing it right." What started as one traffic stop had become a movement for change, led by the most unlikely of reformers. The next phase would bring challenges nobody expected, but the groundwork had been laid for real transformation in Palm Beach law enforcement. The police department's conference room was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Officer Wilson sat at the long table, his uniform crisp as always, but his face showed the strain of the past few weeks. Across from him sat the police chief, the department's legal counsel, and 3 members of the internal affairs team. "Based on our investigation," the chief began, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of the moment, "we have no choice but to terminate your employment with the Palm Beach Police Department, effective immediately." Wilson's face didn't change. He'd known this was coming since the security footage from Trump's car went public. The evidence was too clear, the pattern too obvious to deny. Still, 15 years on the force, it was hard to see it end like this. The termination hearing lasted less than an hour, but its impact would be felt for years to come. As Wilson turned in his badge and gun, other officers watched from their desks. Some had worked with him for years, shared meals with him, backed him up on dangerous calls. Now they were witnessing the end of his career. Word spread quickly through the department. Officers gathered in small groups, their conversations hushed but intense. Some defended Wilson, arguing that traffic stops were part of the job. Others shook their heads, remembering times they'd seen him go too far but stayed quiet. A young officer, just 2 years on the force, spoke up during roll call. "I rode with him during my training," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I saw how he treated people. I knew it wasn't right, but I was new. I didn't know what to say. I wish I'd said something sooner." The police union called an emergency meeting. The room was packed with officers, some angry, some worried about their own records. The union president tried to strike a balance between supporting officers and acknowledging the need for change. "This isn't about one bad apple," he told the crowded room. "This is about looking at ourselves honestly. We can defend good policing while admitting we need to do better." Outside the police station, community reaction was just as divided. Some residents praised the department for taking decisive action. Others worried that Wilson was being sacrificed to appease public pressure. Local social media buzzed with debate. A group of retired officers met at their usual coffee shop. They'd known Wilson for years, watched him rise through the ranks. "He was a good cop once," one of them said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Somewhere along the way, he lost sight of what that means." The department's minority officers had their own perspective. Many had stayed quiet during Wilson's years of problematic stops, caught between loyalty to their fellow officers and awareness of what was happening. Now they felt more empowered to speak up. At the next community meeting, one of these officers shared his story. "I saw both sides," he told the crowd. "I wore the uniform, but I also knew what it felt like to be pulled over for no reason. Wilson's firing isn't the end, it's just the beginning of fixing things." Trump's driver attended the meeting too. He sat quietly in the back, listening as people debated the decision. Some residents approached him during the break, asking about his experience. His responses were measured, focused on moving forward rather than dwelling on the past. The police chief held a press conference to announce changes in department policy. New training programs would be implemented. Body camera footage would be reviewed regularly. Complaint procedures would be overhauled. Wilson's termination wasn't just about one officer, it was about changing the culture. Local businesses began putting up signs welcoming all workers, regardless of their job or appearance. It was a small gesture, but it sent a message. Palm Beach was changing. The invisible barriers that had divided the community were starting to come down. Wilson himself remained mostly silent. He cleared out his locker late one evening, when most officers had gone home. In his car, he found an old citation book filled with years of traffic stops. Each entry represented a moment where things could have gone differently. The sun was setting as he drove home that last time. In his rearview mirror, he could see the police station growing smaller. Ahead of him lay an uncertain future, but behind him, he left a department forever changed by his actions. That night, in homes across Palm Beach, dinner conversations revolved around police accountability, community trust, and the price of staying silent in the face of wrongdoing. Parents talked to their children about treating everyone with respect. Officers talked to their families about the importance of doing what's right, even when it's hard. What started as one traffic stop had led to a reckoning that nobody expected. Wilson's termination wasn't just the end of one career, it was the beginning of a new chapter for Palm Beach law enforcement. The real work of rebuilding trust and ensuring justice was just beginning. Nobody expected the scene unfolding in Palm Beach's community center that morning. Trump walked in, not with his usual business associates or political allies, but with a group of civil rights leaders who had spent years criticizing his policies. The room buzzed with whispers as people tried to make sense of this unlikely gathering. "Look," Trump said, addressing the packed room, "we might not agree on everything. Actually, we probably disagree on most things. But this isn't about politics. This is about doing what's right for our community." The leader of a local civil rights organization stood next to Trump, looking just as surprised to be there as everyone else. When I got a call from Trump's office, she told the crowd, I thought it was a joke. But after meeting with him, I realized something important. Sometimes the right cause can bring together the most unexpected allies. The meeting that followed was unlike anything Palm Beach had seen before. Trump's supporters sat next to longtime critics. Wealthy residents listened as service workers shared their experiences. Police officers engaged in honest conversations with community activists. The usual barriers of politics, wealth, and status seemed to fade away. One community activist who had organized protests against Trump's policies just months earlier found himself working alongside Trump's team to develop new police oversight measures. It's strange, he admitted during a coffee break. But when he showed us the evidence, when we saw how he responded to his driver's situation, we realized this was a chance for real change. Trump's driver became a bridge between different worlds. He shared his story with both wealthy employers and working-class communities, helping each understand the other's perspective. His professional demeanor and clear account of events made it impossible for anyone to dismiss the reality of what had been happening. The local media struggled to make sense of this new dynamic. Reporters watched as Trump and civil rights leaders worked together, planning community outreach programs and police reform initiatives. One newspaper headline read, "Former adversaries unite for police reform, Palm Beach's unexpected alliance." In the police department, officers watched this collaboration with mixed feelings. Some were uncomfortable seeing Trump work with groups they'd considered adversaries. Others saw it as a sign that real change was possible. A veteran officer summed it up during a shift briefing. If these people can put aside their differences for the greater good, maybe we need to rethink some things too. The alliance began producing results. Together, they created a citizens' advisory board to review police practices. They established a community outreach program that brought officers and residents together for regular discussions. They developed new training programs that focused on building trust and understanding. Trump opened Mar-a-Lago for community meetings, something that had never happened before. Service workers who normally only entered through back doors now walked through the main entrance, sitting in the same rooms where world leaders had dined. It was a powerful symbol of changing times. Local business leaders, seeing this unusual coalition's success, began their own initiatives. They created programs to help service workers report incidents of discrimination. They funded scholarships for children from working-class families. They realized that supporting their workers meant more than just providing a paycheck. The civil rights leaders found themselves in an unexpected position, explaining to their supporters why working with Trump made sense. "We don't have to agree with everything he's done," one leader explained at a community meeting. "But when someone steps up to do the right thing, we have to be willing to work with them." Trump's approach surprised many. Instead of his usual social media announcements, he focused on quiet, effective action. He listened more than he spoke. He let others take the lead when their expertise was needed. It was a side of him that few had seen before. As word of Palm Beach's unusual alliance spread, other communities took notice. Civil rights organizations and business leaders from other cities began asking how they'd managed to bridge such deep divides. The answer was always the same: they'd found a cause bigger than their differences. One evening, after a particularly productive meeting, Trump's driver stayed behind to help clean up. He watched as his employer chatted with people who, just months ago, would have been considered enemies. Sometimes, he said to no one in particular, it takes something unexpected to bring out the best in people. The sun was setting over Palm Beach, casting long shadows across the community center's parking lot. Inside, the unlikely allies were still working, planning their next steps. They had different backgrounds, different beliefs, different lives. But they had found common ground in the pursuit of justice and fairness. What started as a single incident had created something nobody could have predicted: a coalition that transcended political divisions, social barriers, and personal differences. It wasn't always easy, and they didn't always agree, but they were proving that real change was possible when people chose to work together instead of against each other. 1 year after the traffic stop that changed Palm Beach, the community gathered at the newly built Community Justice Center. The building itself told the story. Funded jointly by Trump, local businesses, and community organizations, it stood as a symbol of what could be accomplished when people worked together. Trump's former driver, now the center's executive director, stood at the podium addressing a packed room. "When I was pulled over that night," he began, "I never imagined it would lead to this. But sometimes the worst moments can spark the best changes." The center had become a model for other communities across the country. Its programs included police training workshops, community outreach initiatives, and support services for workers who faced discrimination. Police departments from other cities sent representatives to learn from Palm Beach's example. In the police department, the changes were clear. Every new officer now went through enhanced training that included spending time with community members, learning their stories, and understanding their perspectives. Body cameras weren't just worn. Their footage was regularly reviewed by a committee that included both officers and citizens. "It's different now," said one veteran officer during a community meeting. "When I stop someone, they don't automatically fear the worst. There's a basic trust that wasn't there before. We had to earn that trust back, one interaction at a time." The department's statistics told the story. Traffic stops showed no racial or occupational disparities. Complaint numbers had dropped dramatically, but more importantly, when complaints did come in, they were handled transparently and fairly. No more buried reports, no more ignored voices. Local businesses had embraced the change. The signs they'd put up welcoming all workers had become permanent fixtures. But more than that, they'd created programs to support their employees, legal aid services, transportation assistance, and education opportunities. They'd learned that treating workers with respect wasn't just right, it was good business. Trump's involvement had evolved too. Instead of leading the charge, he'd stepped back, letting the community take ownership of the changes. But his influence remained. When other wealthy communities faced similar issues, he shared Palm Beach's story, encouraging them to take action before problems escalated. The former officer, Wilson, had become an unexpected part of the story. After his termination, he'd gone through a period of reflection. Now he spoke at police training sessions, sharing his story as a cautionary tale. "I lost my way," he would tell the officers. "Don't make the same mistakes I did." One morning, a group of service workers gathered at the center for their monthly meeting. They represented the backbone of Palm Beach, the housekeepers, gardeners, maintenance workers, and drivers who kept the community running. Their conversations were different now. They talked about feeling respected, about being treated as essential members of the community rather than outsiders. The center had created a scholarship program, helping workers' children pursue higher education. The first class of scholars was preparing to graduate from college. One of them, whose parent had faced frequent harassment before the changes, was planning to become a civil rights attorney. During a community festival, someone captured a telling moment on camera. Trump stood chatting with a group of service workers, not as a former president or wealthy resident, but as a neighbor. The photo went viral, not for its novelty, but for how normal it had become. The impact reached beyond Palm Beach. Other wealthy communities began examining their own practices. Police departments started reviewing their traffic stop data. Workers in other cities felt empowered to speak up about their experiences. What happened in Palm Beach had become a blueprint for change. One evening, as the sun set over the Atlantic, Trump's former driver stood on the center's balcony. Below, a group of police officers and community members were leaving after a joint training session. They walked together, talking and laughing like old friends. "You know what the real change is," he said to a visitor. "It's not just the policies or programs. It's that people see each other now. Really see each other. As humans, not stereotypes. That's what makes this last." The center had a wall of photos showing the community's journey. The traffic stop footage that started it all. The first meetings between unlikely allies. The groundbreaking ceremony for the center. Each image told part of the story, but the real story was in the daily interactions that had become routine, the mutual respect, the open dialogue, the shared commitment to doing better. As night fell over Palm Beach, the lights of the Community Justice Center glowed like a beacon. Inside, the next day's programs were already planned. Another training session, another community meeting, another step forward. What started with one traffic stop had become a movement, proving that real change was possible when people chose to make it happen.